Hello, everyone. So in this lecture, I'm going to provide some brief context about disability, sexuality, and queerness. So I'll touch on the broader history of disability, the disability rights movement as well. And so you can see that there are boxes in the background. I'm actually recording this from my sister's bedroom. I'm in LA to help take care of my mom right now, and this is the best place to record a video. Um, so the main themes of this lecture are that there's a difference between what it means to have an impairment and what it means to be disabled. So what it means to be disabled is socially constructed and it evolves over time. Ableism has resulted in significant oppression against disabled people, most typically manifested through lack of accessibility, lack of representation, and stigmatization. Disability has also been fundamentally shaped by sexuality, gender, and queerness, as well as other categories. So while the disability rights movement has made important strides in the rights, in advancing the rights of disabled people, there's still much that needs to be done. So I would say that we still need a broader disability justice movement that approaches disability rights activism through an intersectional lens, one that foregrounds the experiences of, in particular, of queer disabled people of color, trans disabled people, and poor disabled people. Okay, so I want to define what disability means to start off. So this is a quote by Kim Nielsen, who wrote a book on the history of disability in the United States. And she writes, quote, one can move in and out of the category of people with disabilities. One can be temporarily disabled due to accident or illness. Disabilities can be easily read by others, right? Perhaps signified by the presence of a wheelchair or the sounds of a speech impairment, or more typically, or they could be more difficult to discern, such as some psychological disabilities or neurological disabilities, unquote. So, in other words, many people become disabled over the course of their lives. Some people live with disabilities all of their lives, and sometimes people are temporarily disabled. And there are both visible and invisible disabilities, disabilities that are physical and disabilities that are psychological. So, Kim Nielsen emphasizes that disability is not just a bodily category, but is actually a social category shaped by changing social factors. So, what's considered a disability, how disabling the disability might be, the stigma people experience, and the rights people with disabilities have are all determined by our social context, by our culture, by politics, religion, technology, and so on. So let's use myself as an example. Um, okay, I have glasses, right? A couple of hundred years ago, my poor vision would have made it impossible for me to work as a teacher where I need to read constantly, read and write. So, adaptive devices like eyeglasses have helped people be considered either less disabled or not disabled at all. Um, also being gay. So, once being gay was described as a mental illness, but that's changed since the 1970s when gay rights activists convinced the American Psychological Association to take homosexuality out of the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, the DSM. So, disability scholars and disability rights activists have further helped to make clear how what it means to be disabled is very much political. So, disability theorist Michael Oliver, for instance, distinguishes between impairment and disability. Oliver defines impairment as, quote, lacking part or all of a limb or having a defective limb, organism or mechanism of the body, unquote. That's his quote. So, um, by contrast, Oliver defines disability as, quote, the disadvantage or restriction of activity caused by contemporary social organization, which takes no or little account of people who have physical and or cognitive or intellectual impairments and thus excludes them from the mainstream of society, unquote. In other words, many people are disabled because society actively disables them by refusing to provide accommodations and by discriminating against them. So this gets us to our definition of ableism. It's a system of oppression that favors able-bodiedness and able-mindedness at the expense of people with disabilities. So as a system of oppression, it touches everything. Here are some examples. Um, so queer disabled activist Stacey Milburn described her experience flying. She said that unlike buses, airplanes are not wheelchair accessible. And so flying means that she's much more dependent on strangers to get her onto a seat from her wheelchair, and that for the duration of the flight, she's more immobile and dependent. Thus, the airline companies actively disable her, right? And with, of course, it should be noted, government complicity that does not require airlines to be more accessible. So another example would be education, where we see ableism. Disabled children, whatever their disability, physical, cognitive, whatever, are often segregated from able-bodied children and put into special education classes that often put them at disadvantage, give them disadvantages. Um, in this case, whatever the impairment the child has, the education system basically actively disables them. So another example, in employment. In 2020, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, only 17.9% of people with disabilities were employed, as compared to 61.8% of the able-bodied population. So in this case, employers, again, with the complicity of our government that doesn't mandate more work-related accommodations and doesn't actively enforce anti-discrimination law, so employers actively disable people with various kinds of impairments by refusing to employ them and giving them the means that they need, right, the financial means to survive in our society. Another example is policing. 50% of people killed by the police are disabled, and more than half of disabled African Americans have been arrested by the time they turn 28 years old. This is double the risk in comparison to their white disabled counterparts. So in this case, rather than providing support services, our criminal justice system actively disables people by depriving them of their lives and their freedom. So to combat the ways in which society marginalizes and excludes disabled people, many disabled people have redefined what it means to be disabled. So disabled genderqueer activist Eli Clare, for instance, describes his own evolution. He says, quote, I began to reframe my life as a disabled person, the blunt grind of bullying and shame, slowly turning into a nuanced identity connected to political understanding and activism, unquote. As Eli Clare came into consciousness, he writes, quote, the revolution that my cerebral palsy might be something other than pain, grief, and burden split me open, unquote. Disability rights activism has helped people claim their identities as disabled with pride, as they reject commonly held cultural ideas that disability equals tragedy, that to be disabled, you must necessarily want to be cured, or that you wish you were quote unquote normal, i.e., able bodied. So now I want to transition to talking some about the history of disability. And know this is a very general overview, and there's a lot that I don't cover here. I would definitely suggest reading Kim Nielsen's book, A Disability History of the United States, if you'd like to go more in depth into the history, and there are lots of other books about history as well. But this is a pretty good overview. She covers the history of disability through an intersectional lens for the most part. I wouldn't say that she's the best at inserting queerness into her analysis, but other than that, she's like fairly good at being intersectional. So I definitely think it's still worth reading. So for most of US history, there were very few accommodations made for disabled people. If a disabled person had a diminished capacity to labor, it was up to the family to take care of them. Until the 1800s, there were essentially no institutions, no schools or welfare programs to assist disabled people. There were also no laws saying that disabled people had the right not to be discriminated against in schools, employment, or public accommodations. And then in the 1800s, with the rise of industrial capitalism, you start to see the rise of work-related injuries that create a whole new class of disabled people, some temporarily disabled and others permanently disabled as people become increasingly disabled by their work environment. For most of the early history of industrial capitalism, there are few to no, essentially no regulations on like safety regulations at work. And so you see lots of um, work-related injuries and things like mine disasters that kill and disable workers. So Kim Nielsen writes, quote, "It is hard to exaggerate the impact of mines, steel plants, railroad yards, textile factories, lead poisoning, fast assembly lines, and repetitive motion on the bodies of working class men, women, and children," unquote. So when people become disabled, those people who are disabled who require extra caretaking, and it's important to note, right, just because you're disabled doesn't mean you require care. But for those who do, caretaking labor is gendered. So historically, women have been expected to do much of the labor that goes into caring for people with disabilities, right? Of course, those who require extra care. Um, it's also true that well-off women could rely on poor women and women of color to help with this labor, to essentially do this labor from, the enslaved Black women in the 19th century to Latina and Filipina domestic workers and nurses today. But in some circumstances, the community had to take responsibility. People who were deemed insane or who were violent or uncontrollable, or if the family was too poor to care for them, that they could be put into correctional institutions, the same places people were placed who committed crimes. Um, then in the 1800s, you start to see the establishment of various kinds of institutions, schools, and what were called insane asylums for people with disabilities. These start to, I should note, close down in the 1970s and 1980s, and they were like there were lots of problems with these asylums and these institutions. They start to get closed down, and so you see a really dramatic increase in the number of disabled homeless people starting in the 70s and 80s. Um, so even as we see the rise of institutions, women were still responsible for caring for their children with disabilities in the home, but workers in these institutions began to share some of that labor. So, and these institutions could be alternately, they could be empowering or abusive or some combination. So, for example, when touring asylums for the indigent insane in the 1840s, reformer Dorothea Dix was shocked when she saw people who were considered insane locked together in cellars and closets and lashed into obedience. So, physical violence was very common. She continued to investigate the treatment of the mentally ill, and then you start to see some reforms in state after state to rectify some of the abuses as a result of this activism by her and others, but there's still lots of problems that continue to exist. So then Gallaudet College could be cited as an example of an empowering institution. It was the first college specifically for deaf people. Founded in 1864, it exists today as well. So it was clearly empowering, right, to have an institution where you can get an education, higher education. It also had some problems, though, that I think it's important to emphasize. It excluded women early in its history and only began to slowly admit them in 1887, so over 20 years later after its founding. Um, the school was also racially segregated. It wasn't until the 1954, in fact, that the first Black student, Andrew Foster, graduated from Gallaudet College. So I want to fast forward to the 1970s and talk a little bit about the disability rights movement. So, inspired by other activists of the period, the disability rights movement gained traction in the 1970s. Kim Nielsen writes, quote, "Just as the civil rights movement critiqued hierarchy based on racial differences, and just as the feminist movement critiqued hierarchy based on sex and gender differences, The disability rights movement critiqued hierarchy based on the physical, sensory, and mental differences of disability. In other words, rights activists wanted to shift public policy from treating them as medically deficient to treating disabled people as a minority group subject to unfair discrimination. Um, they argued that the role of government was to protect their civil rights to participate in society by eliminating discrimination. And so activists with disabilities they organized to combat discrimination in employment and education. They fought for access to public spaces and public transportation and sought institutional transformations that better enabled the self-determination of those with disabilities. So then we get to the Section 504 protest, perhaps one of the most significant moments in the history of the disability rights movement. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, so this was a piece of legislation passed in 1973, mainly due to the fact that there were a lot of veterans coming home from the Vietnam War who were disabled and they needed some accommodations in public life. So Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act said that people with disabilities, quote, should not be, quote, denied the benefits of or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, unquote. So note, of course, it's a significant piece of legislation, but it's limited to any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance, so government money from the federal government, not the state government. So the bill passed, but was ultimately only enforced due to the activism of disabled people across the country. People sat in government offices to demand the enforcement of Section 504 for a long time, in particular in San Francisco. So, and then you get the Americans with Disabilities Act. It was essentially the crowning achievement of the disability rights movement. When it was first introduced in Congress in 1988, disabled people, advocates, and family members from all over the country went to Congress to share their stories of discrimination, of harassment, and of inaccessibility. In their campaign to pressure Congress to pass the legislation, disabled activists and allies organized a protest in 1990 in which they literally crawled up the steps of the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., to demonstrate the need for accessibility in public spaces. The ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, prohibits employment, access, housing, and educational discrimination against disabled people. In 1990, though, when it was finally signed into law by George Bush, the president, it explicitly excluded trans people because conservative politicians demanded that the ADA specifically exclude, quote, transvestitism, transsexualism, and gender identity disorders, unquote. So this meant that trans people couldn't access any of the protections or rights of the Americans with Disabilities Act for many years. That should be noted in 2017, a court in Pennsylvania did rule that the ADA can actually cover gender dysphoria specifically. So there are also tons of improvements that still need to be made. So just because the ADA passed doesn't mean that we live in an equal society, just as just because the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was passed means that we live in an racially equal society. So tons of improvements need to be made still. I listed some of them already, but if you look at employment, right, I said that 17.9% of disabled people in the US are currently employed, which is because of two things. The United States doesn't enforce anti-discrimination policies. That's always the case, or doesn't enforce them enough anyway. And two, it doesn't have affirmative action policies to make it so that employers must accommodate people with disabilities by hiring them. So by contrast, in Europe, nearly 50% of disabled people are employed because European countries tend to take more affirmative action to make it so that disabled people can actually be employed. So now I want to look more at specifically at how gender and sexuality relate to disability. So I already mentioned the gendered aspects of caretaking responsibilities. Historically, who violated traditional, so I mentioned that, right? But also, historically, women who violated traditional gender norms were stigmatized as disabled. For example, in 1927, in the Buck v. Bell decision, the Supreme Court decided that forced sterilization of quote unquote unfit women was perfectly constitutional. And this included forced sterilization of the intellectually disabled. And so there's a long history of forced or coerced sterilization of poor women, of women of color, in particular, Native American women and Puerto Rican women. Have been sterilized in very large numbers throughout the 20th century. So this Supreme Court decision was actually based on a lawsuit brought by Carrie Buck, who was sterilized. She was a very young, poor woman who was declared "quote unquote" feeble-minded by the court after she gave birth out of wedlock as a young woman. Never mind that actually she got pregnant because she was raped. So also historically and even in the present day, for cisgender men to be properly masculine, they have been expected to have sharp intellects and powerful bodies. Thus, to be disabled casts doubt on their claim to masculinity. So if you extend this right to transmasculine people who are also disabled, it can be that much more challenging for their gender identity and their forms of masculine gender expression to be accepted by society. Gender norms have also historically, as well as presently, determined our beauty standards. So through much of the 20th century and into the 21st century, beauty standards promoted by pop culture have dictated that white, typically feminine, thin, straight, and cisgender women set the standard for what's considered beautiful and desirable. She's also supposed to be considered able-bodied, though. It's been difficult for women with visible disabilities to be considered beautiful and sexy and to be objects of romantic attention in the mainstream United States. Queer disabled people coming out of the closet and claiming their sexuality have to overcome both compulsory heterosexuality, this idea that being straight is normal and desirable, and they've had to overcome this idea that disabled people are neither capable of desire or of being desired. So disability scholar Robert McRuer, who's the author of this book called Crip Theory, Cultural Signs of Queerness and Disability, argues that, quote, the system of compulsory able-bodiedness that produces disability is thoroughly interwoven with the system of compulsory heterosexuality that produces queerness. What does he mean by this? So compulsory heterosexuality says that, right, heterosexuality is normal, and thus homosexuality, basically anything other than heterosexuality, right? Homosexuality, bisexuality, pansexuality is subordinated as abnormal or deviant. And because people want to be considered normal, generally speaking, there doesn't seem to be much of a choice, right? This is what is meant by compulsory heterosexuality, this idea that was first offered up by Adrienne Rich. So heterosexuality feels very much compulsory, right, or forced, rather than it feeling like a choice to most people. So a critique of normalcy, writes Robert McRuer, has been central to the disability rights movement, just as it has been to queer rights activism. He writes, quote, arguably, able-bodied identity is at this juncture even more naturalized than heterosexual identity, unquote. Because being able-bodied or disabled is often viewed as being rooted in the body and thus inescapably biological rather than culturally constructed. So it's even more naturalized, right? This idea that being able-bodied is normal. So McGruer argues that our institutions largely treat able-bodiedness as the norm, making disabled people out to be abnormal. He says that the question everybody asks of disabled people is, but wouldn't you rather be able-bodied, right? If you're deaf, wouldn't you rather be hearing? If you're blind, wouldn't you rather see? If you rely on a wheelchair, wouldn't you rather be able to walk? And so on. He writes, quote, the culture asking such questions assumes in advance that we all agree. Able-bodied identities, able-bodied perspectives are preferable and what we all collectively are aiming for. A system of compulsory able-bodiedness repeatedly demands that people with disabilities embody for others an affirmative answer to the unspoken question, yes, but in the end, wouldn't you rather be more like me? Right, and this should sound familiar in some ways, right? Because like a lot of parents, when they hear that their kid is gay, they think it's a tragedy. Like you're not going to lead a normal life. Wouldn't you rather be straight? Right? It's the same thing that people with disabilities, same kind of experience that people with disabilities have. So, how else might we think about the intersection of queerness and disability? And this is not going to be comprehensive, but number one, of course, is oppression. We can think about how homophobia and transphobia intersect with ableism to shape the lives of queer disabled people. You know, for instance, somebody who is queer and disabled is more likely to be homeless, to face employment-based discrimination, and to experience the alienating features of an educational system that doesn't address their identities and experiences in a world that favors heterosexual, cisgender, and able-bodied experiences. And of course, if we look at how queerness and disability intersect with other systems of oppression like racism and misogyny, colonialism and capitalism, outcomes become even worse. So a second way to think about this is, right, the important conceptual parallels that help us understand better what it means to be disabled and queer. So Eli Clare, who I've already quoted, a genderqueer disabled white person, talks about the ways that both queer and disabled people have been considered abnormal and have been subject to being stared at and whispered about by strangers in public. There's also common feelings of, or parallel feelings of isolation and shame and the experience of being bullied that queer and disabled people share in common. For example, most queer people are born to straight, cisgender families and must struggle to find community and thus suffer from feelings of isolation, just as most disabled people are largely a part of able-bodied families. And it can feel like a very isolating experience when your family members pathologize you, think of you as tragic, attempt to cure you. Right? So disabled people, like queer people, must try to find community to gain a sense of empowerment and pride in their identities because they have these feelings of isolation. So if you are both queer and disabled, it can feel that much more isolating and challenging to find community. A third way to think about the relationship between queerness and disability is pathologization or medicalization. So queer people have been historically and continue to be medicalized and pathologized. I mentioned already that homosexuality was once considered a mental illness, right? That was taken out of the DSM in the 1970s. So being transgender is still sort of in the DSM. So it's a little complicated, but so in 2013, it's actually the case that, so right, 1975, homosexuality is taken out of the DSM. Gay people are no longer pathologized in the same way as trans people, but then it's only in 2013 that gender identity disorder was eliminated in the DSM-5, and it was replaced with a new category called gender dysphoria. So what does this mean? So what's the difference? In the magazine Scientific American, a pediatric endocrinologist says, quote, the new diagnosis recognized that a mismatch between one's birth gender and identity was not necessarily pathological, but right, it shifted the emphasis in treatment from fixing a disorder to resolving distress over this mismatch. That said, you know, trans people often have to pursue right medical help to pursue any kind of medical transition, including psychological counseling. Okay, to conclude, it's clear that there's still much to be done to advance the rights of disabled people. Sins Invalid, a disability justice performance and activist group that is led by queer disabled people of color, is doing some really important work that helps to point the way forward. In their disability justice primer, which I Anyway, in their disability justice primer, they write that, quote, able-bodied supremacy has been formed in relation to other systems of domination and exploitation. The histories of white supremacy and ableism are inextricably entwined, both forged in the crucible of colonial conquest and capitalist domination. A disability justice framework understands that all bodies are unique and essential, that all bodies have strengths and needs that must be met. We know we are powerful not despite the complexities of our bodies, but because of them, unquote. Okay, that's it. But I just want you to, the last thing I'll say is just view this lecture as a sort of a short introduction to this topic, the topic, disability as a topic. I really encourage you to learn more and ask more questions.